Welcome to DuctTales. Ever feel like breastfeeding info can be a little much? We're going to break down those breastfeeding books chapter by chapter and get to the good stuff.
Yeah, like a shortcut to breastfeeding knowledge. You don't have to read all those pages yourself.
Right. And for our first deep dive, we're tackling What Doctors Don't Know About Breastfeeding by Dr. Jack Newman and Andrea Polikova.
Ooh, that title is pretty catchy.
Yeah, it really makes you think, what don't they know?
Right.
So this episode, we're focusing on the intro chapter where they talk about why they even wrote this book in the first place.
Yeah, and it gets pretty interesting, right away.
For sure.
One of the first things that I noticed was this quote: "Most physicians know so little about breastfeeding that they do not know what they do not know."
Whoa, that's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah.
So it's like saying even doctors, the people we think of as the experts, can have these blind spots.
Yeah, and that's kind of what they're getting at. They're saying that this lack of knowledge, in the medical community, it's not always about them, not caring or anything.
Yeah.
It often comes down to how doctors are even taught about this stuff and just, societal norms,
So are they saying this is a systemic issue then?
Exactly. It's not just a few doctors who are out of the loop.
Gotcha.
The book talks about how breastfeeding isn't really focused on in a lot of medical training programs.
Right.
So doctors might spend years learning about all these complicated procedures, but practical breastfeeding support kind of gets left behind.
That's pretty surprising, especially because breastfeeding is so important for moms and babies.
Yeah, and the authors make it really clear that this lack of knowledge can actually have some bad consequences.
Like what?
Well, for example, a mom might be having a problem with breastfeeding, and instead of getting help, she's told to just switch to formula.
Oh, wow.
You know.
I bet that's really discouraging.
Oh, absolutely, especially if she really wants to breastfeed.
Yeah.
And that's why this book is so important. It's like shining a light on these problems and makes us question what we think about breastfeeding support.
So what are some of the reasons they give for this knowledge gap?
Well, one thing is just how common bottle feeding is.
Okay.
It's become so normal that it kind of influences how everyone sees infant feeding, even doctors.
That's true.
If doctors are always seeing babies being fed formula, it might affect their advice without them even realizing it.
Right.
Yeah, and the book uses a really good example of this.
What's that?
It's about how often a baby should be fed, which is often based on formula schedules.
Interesting.
But that doesn't really work with how breastfeeding actually is.
Yeah, that's a good point. I never thought about it like that before.
Yeah, breastfeeding is all about supply and demand.
Right.
It's not about following a strict schedule with formula.
So having a good understanding of how breastfeeding actually works is really important.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about doctors not knowing enough. But why is that such a big deal?
Well, for moms, it can make them feel like they're failing if breastfeeding doesn't go smoothly.
Yeah.
It can lead to more anxiety, depression, even grief.
That's so sad, especially at a time that's already so emotional.
Yeah. And then there are the health risks for babies, too.
Oh, right.
The book lists a bunch of risks linked to not breastfeeding, like diarrhea, respiratory infections, and even SIDS.
That's serious.
And they also talk about a really scary risk for preemies called necrotizing enterocolitis, or NEC. It's a problem with their intestines, and it can have lasting effects.
That's really frightening.
It is, and these aren't just random opinions. The authors have solid evidence to back this up.
So it's not about personal preference. It's about recognizing the real benefits of breastfeeding.
Exactly, and that's why they were so passionate about writing this book.
Oh.
They wanted to bring these issues to light and push for better breastfeeding support.
It sounds like this book isn't just about blaming doctors. It's more about helping moms and doctors understand each other better.
That's it. They're all about working together where moms feel comfortable asking questions and doctors know how to really help.
That makes a lot of sense.
It's about being partners, not one person having all the power.
Right. That's a good way to put it. And this is just the start. We haven't even gotten to the 4 main challenges they talk about that make breastfeeding harder. Okay, I'm definitely interested now, but before we jump into that, can you tell us a bit about the authors? Who are these people who felt so strongly about writing this book?
Well, we have Andrea Polikova. She's a lactation consultant, and she has tons of experience.
Okay.
She's been helping moms for over 20 years. She's trained a bunch of other lactation consultants, and she even works with like marginalized communities to improve breastfeeding support.
Wow, she seems really dedicated to this.
Oh, yeah, she totally is. And then there's Dr. Jack Newman. He's a pediatrician who has been supporting breastfeeding moms for like almost 40 years.
Aw.
He's even got personal experience. All 3 of his kids were breastfed until they were 4. Yeah, so they bring a pretty unique mix of expertise.
Definitely.
Andrea's got that hands-on experience from working directly with moms, and Dr. Newman has the medical perspective.
Makes sense.
And you can really see their knowledge and passion in this book.
I'm hooked, and we're just getting started.
I know, right? This intro has already given us a lot to think about.
For sure. I can't wait to hear more. But before we get to those 4 challenges, let's take a quick break. All right. We're back and ready to dig into those 4 challenges to successful breastfeeding that the authors talk about.
Okay.
The first one, the medical system itself feels kind of huge.
Yeah.
Where do we even start with that?
Yeah, it is complicated, but the authors do a good job of breaking it down.
Okay.
Basically, they're saying that how healthcare is set up can sometimes make breastfeeding harder, even if it's not on purpose.
So it's not like doctors are trying to stop moms from breastfeeding. It's more like the system itself is making it tough.
Yeah, exactly. Like, think about it. How often do doctors really talk about breastfeeding when you're pregnant? The authors point out that it doesn't happen as much as it should.
Yeah, I guess I never really thought about that.
It's like maybe they're worried about making moms feel bad if they don't want to breastfeed.
Right, that makes sense.
But then on the other hand, if they don't talk about it enough, moms might not get all the info and support they need to be successful.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, so it's all about finding that balance between being supportive and not being pushy.
Totally. And then there's the whole time crunch thing.
Oh, yeah. Appointments are always so short.
Exactly. It's hard to give someone all the breastfeeding help they need in like 15 minutes.
That's true. I can imagine it would be hard to cover everything.
Right. And if the doctor hasn't had enough training on how to deal with breastfeeding problems, they might not feel comfortable helping.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's kind of like this chain reaction. The system doesn't make breastfeeding a priority, so doctors don't get enough training. And then moms end up not getting the support they need.
Like a domino effect.
Exactly. And this all connects to the second challenge the authors talk about, the idea that formula is just as good as breast milk.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that one a lot.
It's tricky because it's not that formula is bad or anything.
Yeah.
It's more about understanding that breast milk has its own unique benefits that formula just can't match.
So it's recognizing that there is a difference even if you can't always see it right away.
Exactly. The authors say this formula is equivalent. Thinking comes from what people see and experience, but sometimes that overshadows the actual science that shows how breast milk is special.
So it's not about ignoring people's experiences. It's about making sure those experiences are based on good information.
Exactly. And the authors are really careful not to judge anyone who chooses formula. They just want people to have all the facts so they can make the best decision.
That makes sense. And speaking of influencing decisions, I think we have to talk about the formula industry.
Oh, yeah.
They have a big impact on how people see infant feeding, right?
Oh, absolutely. And the authors don't hold back when talking about their tactics. Like, think about how much formula advertising there is.
It's everywhere.
Right. You can't escape it. And then there's all the free stuff they give new parents.
Oh, yeah.
Which can be really tempting, especially when you're exhausted and overwhelmed.
For sure.
It's a really smart marketing strategy, but the authors ask some tough questions about whether it's ethical.
Like if they're taking advantage of parents who are vulnerable.
Exactly. And it's not just marketing to moms. Formula companies also target doctors with educational materials, sponsorships for conferences, even funding for research.
Wow. Never thought about that.
Yeah, it makes sense if doctors are constantly hearing about the latest and greatest formula. It's going to affect how they think about infant feeding.
That's true.
And it all goes back to that second challenge, the belief that formula is just as good.
Right.
It's subtle, but it can really influence people.
Yeah, it's a good reminder to be careful about where our information is coming from, especially when someone's trying to sell us something.
Exactly. Okay, and then we have the fourth challenge, lack of good maternity leave.
Ooh, yeah, that's a big one, especially here in the U.S., where paid maternity leave is still not a guarantee.
Yeah, and the authors are really clear that they see this as a major hurdle for successful breastfeeding.
Okay.
Moms often feel like they have to go back to work before they've even gotten the hang of breastfeeding,
Right.
let alone settled into a routine.
And pumping's not always a perfect solution.
Definitely.
It can be stressful, time-consuming, and sometimes it just doesn't work well.
Right, and the authors are pretty critical of the focus on pumping as the answer to this problem.
Okay.
They say that giving out pumps without fixing the real problem, which is not having enough maternity leave, is like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg.
Yeah, it's a temporary fix that doesn't address the root of the issue.
Exactly. Moms need time to recover from childbirth bond with their babies and figure out breastfeeding without the pressure of work hanging over them.
Right.
And this is where it becomes not just a personal issue, but a societal one. The authors make a really good argument for longer paid maternity leave. They say it's not just good for moms and babies, but for everyone.
It's like recognizing that supporting moms in those early months helps everyone in the long run.
Exactly. And that's what's so cool about this book. It looks at these issues from so many different angles, personal, medical, and societal.
So we've talked about these 4 challenges, but what about solutions? Do the authors offer any advice on how to make things better?
They do, and that's what we're going to talk about next.
We're back. So we just spent some time talking about those 4 challenges to breastfeeding, and it sounds like there are some real obstacles out there, but I'm hoping the authors give us some solutions too, because otherwise this is kind of depressing.
Oh yeah, don't worry, it's not all bad news. The authors are really good at pointing out the problems, but they also offer a lot of hope and practical advice.
Okay, good. So what are some of the solutions? Like, where do we even start to fix these things?
Well, they have a whole plan that looks at things from both an individual and a systemic level. One of the first things they talk about is how important it is to empower moms with knowledge.
Like making sure women have the information they need to make good choices about their breastfeeding journey.
Exactly. It's about helping them understand how breastfeeding works, what kinds of challenges they might run into, and where to get support if they need it.
That makes sense. Like they say, knowledge is power.
Right. But what about the doctors? How do we make sure they are better prepared to support breastfeeding moms?
It's a good question.
Well, the authors are really big on changing how doctors are educated.
Okay.
They think that breastfeeding should be a much bigger part of medical school and residency programs.
So not just like a quick lecture about breast milk, but actual training on how to help with breastfeeding problems.
Exactly. They say doctors need to be able to spot things like tongue tie, help with positioning and latch, and offer solutions to things like low milk supply.
So they're basically saying that breastfeeding support should just be a normal part of healthcare, not something extra.
Exactly. And they also talk about bigger societal changes, like making sure everyone has paid maternity leave.
That'd be amazing.
Yeah.
But those kinds of changes take time and getting politicians on board.
Yeah, they do. But the authors believe that with enough people talking about it and fighting for it, these changes are possible. They also remind us that advocating for breastfeeding isn't just about babies, it's about supporting women's rights and making a fairer society.
That's a really good point. It's not just a personal choice, it's about creating a culture where motherhood is valued and supported.
Absolutely. And we can all play a role, even in small ways.
Okay.
Like just listening to a mom who's struggling without judging her, offering to help, or speaking up when you hear negative stuff about breastfeeding.
Yeah, it's about building a community where moms feel comfortable breastfeeding without worrying about what other people think.
Exactly. And that's what this book is all about. Making those changes happen one conversation at a time.
So what are your final thoughts on this introduction? What's the main takeaway for our listeners?
Well, for me, the biggest thing is that we need to stop thinking about breastfeeding as just a personal choice.
Okay.
It's so much more complicated than that. It's affected by things like what doctors know, what our society thinks is normal, and even money.
And that means supporting breastfeeding has to come from all sides.
Mm-hmm.
Moms need good information, doctors need to know how to help, and everyone needs to see breastfeeding as a normal thing.
Exactly. And I think that authors really want us to feel hopeful that change is possible if we're willing to talk about these things and challenge how things are done now.
I definitely feel that way too. This introduction has given me so much to think about. But before we wrap up, can you give us a little sneak peek at next week's episode? What can our listeners look forward to?
Next time we're going way back in time. We'll be diving into a short history of infant feeding. Get ready to learn about what people used to do before formula was invented.
Ooh, that sounds interesting. I can't wait to hear what they gave babies before formula.
Let's just say it wasn't always pretty.
Mysterious.
You'll have to tune in next week to find out more.
And that's it for our very first episode of DuctTales. We hope you found this deep dive into the introduction of What Doctors Don't Know About Breastfeeding insightful.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. And remember, breastfeeding is a journey, not a destination, and you don't have to do it alone. There are so many people out there ready to support you every step of the way.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time for more breastfeeding wisdom.